Hi, welcome to Brass Check TV. This is Ken McCarthy, and we have a special guest today, Douglas Valentine. Douglas, welcome.
Thank you for having me on the show. I hope that I can help educate people a little bit about the things you want to talk about.
Great. And the reason I have Douglas on today is his extreme expertise in the area of U.S. drug policy, so-called policy. Many of us are vaguely aware of strange things going on in Afghanistan and strange things that happened during Iran-Contra and strange things that happened in Vietnam. Actually, the rabbit hole goes very far and very deep, and Doug is one of the masters of understanding how all this stuff works. He's the author of many books, but I'm going to ask him to mention three just off the top before we get into today's topic, which is the strange goings-on in Mexico. Douglas, you've written three books that are particularly interesting on this topic. One on the Phoenix program. Could you give us the title of that?
It's called the Phoenix program.
Easy mnemonic. This is considered the history of the Phoenix program. So if you've ever heard about it, or even if you haven't heard about it, it was a vast program that we can't get into on this show. The U.S. operated in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. It involved detention of uncharged victims. It involved torture. It involved all the kinds of things that we're seeing today under the rubric of defense against terrorism. Doug also wrote two really important books about the history of drug law enforcement in the U.S., and I've got one of them here. The book is called The Strength of the Wolf. You wrote another book on this topic called Strength of the Pack.
Yeah, The Strength of the Pack, and it's basically the sequel.
Okay, so The Strength of the Wolf and The Strength of the Pack, and these are definitive histories on all the agencies that have been involved in drug enforcement and all the strange things that have been going on. And we're going to talk about how far back these strange things go. The story that we're going to talk about today is Operation Drug Runner and Fast and Furious. And these on the surface appear to be careless gun running operations or gun ATF enforcement investigative operations relating to Mexico. I'm going to give some detailed background on these operations, and I'm going to ask Doug for his perspective. And one of the problems that we have, I think it's obvious to everyone, but it bears repeating, is that we don't have a news media in the United States. Either they don't report a story or they ridicule a topic so that anybody that's even interested in it is made to look ridiculous. Or when they do report, it's fragmentary. So you get a little piece here, a little piece there, no historical context, no weaving together of the entire picture. So nobody ever knows what's going on. So it's kind of hard to have a democracy or some kind of enlightened country when no one knows what's going on and the foxes are in charge of the hen house. So quick background on this stuff going on in Mexico. It started under the Bush administration and it continued under the Obama administration. It's gone under the names of Operation Gun Runner and Fast and Furious. And here's the story. And I think it's a cover story, but we'll start with the story. It's been revealed that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, allowed and encouraged people with criminal backgrounds and known connections to Mexican drug cartels to buy guns in the United States from gun shops in Arizona and send them to Mexico. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but nobody's denying it anymore. It happened. It happened to the tune of at least 1,000 or more sort of military-grade weapons. Not only did they allow it, they actually told gun store owners in Arizona when they called up and said, hey, we're a little concerned. This guy keeps coming by and buying 20, 30 AK-47s. Could you look into this guy? He also seems to have a criminal background. And the ATF would get back and say, let him buy them. Let him have them. So some of these guns, in fact, ended up in Mexico. Some of them have ended up being involved in crimes, no surprise. And in one particularly notorious case, a border agent, U.S. border agent, was killed by one of these guns. Thus, the story came out into the public. Now it's come out most recently, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated, but you have a number of drug cartels in Mexico, about a dozen of various sizes and shapes. For years, for decades, they've been operating, and they've been independent of each other, and they've stayed out of each other's hair, and it's been a very prosperous, happy party for everybody. Starting in 2006, a war broke out, and they're killing each other and a lot of Mexican civilians as well. And the estimate is about 50,000 people have been killed, often in very gruesome ways, with the bodies left in very gruesome condition. Lots of cartels down there. One of them, the Los Zetas, has an interesting pedigree. It's made up of people who were trained by the United States Special Forces. They were trained to kill drug cartel leaders. And then they, I guess, decided, you know what, a better job would be to operate our own drug cartel. So that's the Los Zetas. Now, there's a guy in prison in the U.S. who is fighting for his freedom, and he's a member of the Sinaloa cartel, and his name is Zabara Nebla. Here's the story on this guy. He was a high-up-ranking person. He got arrested, and he has been sent to the United States to face trial. His attorney is saying, look, you guys need to know the whole story. The Sinaloa cartel is actually working with the United States in exchange for providing the United States with intelligence. And this is the story they're telling. I think it's a cover story, but this is the story they're telling. In exchange for the Sinaloa cartel providing various U.S. law enforcement agencies with information about the other cartels and helping the U.S. eliminate those cartels, the Sinaloa cartel has been allowed to get basically a get-out-of-jail card. They are not arrested. They are not prosecuted. And they seem to be allowed to import limitless quantities of drugs to the United States, including Chicago. Seems to be one of their main drop-off points. We might talk about that a little bit later, why Chicago seems significant. But anyway, on the surface, we've been told, and it's been admitted that, yeah, we let some guns go to Mexico because it was a sting operation, and we were going to try to follow the guns to the source and bust the leaders, but we kind of lost our attention span and forgot to track the guns, and the guns are all lost. Sorry, guys. Yeah, we compelled Arizona gun store owners to sell these guns against their better judgment. And, of course, now we're going to punish everybody who's interested in owning firearms, especially in the Southwest. And then, by the way, there's a new line on the ATF background check. You have to check off if you're Hispanic or not. That's something that's been added in the last year. Crazy. But I don't want to get too far afield. So, Doug, wow. You've studied this. You've studied what went on in Iran-Contra, in Vietnam. Actually, you've studied this all the way back to the 1920s. Let's jump in here. Let's just ask a general question. Has there ever been a case when the United States government, through its various law enforcement agencies, gave a pass to drug dealers in exchange for getting something else? Has that ever happened? And if it has happened, how often does it happen? And how far back does this go?
Well, it has happened, and it's pretty well documented, and it still happens now. And it's basically because this is not just drug law enforcement and arms sales to allies, foreign allies, or these things don't occur in a vacuum. It's not just about drugs, and it's not just about arms. It's about politics. It's about the context that these things happen in overseas, and that's a political and economic context. So one of the ways that the government can control information and that journalists tell you about these things is by limiting it to just a discussion about drugs and arms, when actually the drugs and arms are only a small part of a political and economic dynamic or determinant about what actually is going on. And this has always been going on. It goes on more often than pure law enforcement operations overseas. And the defining case, of course, is nationalist China. In 1925, the United States threw its weight behind Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government in China, which supported itself basically with opium revenues. But they were fighting communists and engaged with a bunch of other warlords for control of China, which represented a huge market for the United States. It represents cheap labor. It represents billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of trade for the economic class in the United States that makes its money by trading overseas. The United States was in competition in the 20s and 30s with a bunch of other countries for control of China, and it threw its weight behind Chiang Kai-shek through the 20s and 30s. It's very well documented in the diplomatic cables that go back and forth between Treasury representatives in China, State Department representatives in China, and Washington about the extent of the opium traffic through that the Kuomintang nationalist government was involved in. It's all very well documented. It's not even classified communications. These are just, very straightforward. I've read them. The Treasury representatives were saying to the Bureau of Narcotics and the government, Chiang Kai-shek's financier is financing the regime through opium revenues, and they're involved with a gangster named Du Yu Shang through Chiang's finance minister and his intelligence chief, and 8 million addicts in China for for heroin and morphine, and there's 75 million addicts through opium, and they're making huge amounts of money doing this. Enough money that they can buy an air force to fight the communists. So we're going to keep, just keep letting them do it. And the people who are selling them the airplanes are guys like William Pauly, an American who's making a lot of money. And Pauly kicks back a portion of this money that he makes selling airplanes to the Chinese, which they buy with opium and morphine revenues. He kicks back a part of that to his political protectors in the China lobby. This is congressmen and senators, and so they keep passing laws that make this okay out in the Far East. And they do it all very quietly, and nobody in the United States really knows this is going on, but everybody's making a lot of money, including congressmen and senators and politicians, especially investors like Pauly and all those kind of guys, off the Chinese narcotic trafficking. So it just goes on. And when World War II broke out, it became even more important to protect this nationalist Chinese drug smuggling operation as they started fighting the Japanese. And their drug smugglers were able to go into Japan and get on Japanese-held territory like Manchuria, where there was lots of opium growing going on, and get intelligence on the Japanese. So now they've become even more important because they're providing an intelligence function that helps the United States fight its wars. All that was established up to and during World War II. And after World War II, it was the business of managing America's involvement in the narcotic trade worldwide was given basically to the CIA because it could conduct actual support operations for the Chinese out of Taiwan into Burma. The CIA was actually flying opium when nationalist Chinese military forces relocated to Burma after 1949. The CIA actually flew their opium for them so they could continue to finance their operation against communist China. And it just goes on and on. That's one example. But there are a dozen examples. And the whole thing, starting after World War II, was sort of handled by the CIA in league with the military and the State Department and the Treasury Department and the Justice Department, and through the political protection of congressmen who got kickbacks from the industrialists who were profiting by selling arms and supplies and one thing or another to the regimes that trafficked in narcotics that the United States was protecting. So it goes on and on and on and on. And of course, Mexico fits into this equation. And the history of U.S. relations with Mexico is the determinant factor in understanding why the situation with guns and arms exists in Mexico right now. It's a long-standing historical relationship, and it has a lot to do with the United States treating Mexico not really as an ally, not the kind of ally that it had in nationalist China against communists, but the relationship between the United States and Mexico is actually one of animosity. And the United States is not treating Mexico as an ally, but as a potential threat.